The games of Magnus Carlsen are always very interesting to follow, and here at the Grenke Chess Classic 2024 he's playing incredibly exciting chess. In this video I'm going to cover the game he played in round 4 against the Frenchman Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, also called MVL. Because here in this middle game some absolutely bizarre things are happening which you normally don't get to see at this level. It's a fantastic game with beautiful tactical ideas, so let's just dive straight into the action. Magnus is playing with the white pieces, MVL with black. Here we go. E4 is the first move by Magnus Carlsen. E4, C5, knight f3, D6, knight C3, knight f6, and here he goes for the move bishop E2. This is sort of a sideline, has been played before also by Magnus in other games. And interestingly, white still keeps the option open to play the move d2, d4 with a possible transposition to the open Sicilian. But MVL played here the move e5, and of course now you can no longer play the move d4 because black is covering that square. But now, interesting moment already, because after playing the move bishop e2, now the bishop goes to c4. Why is Magnus doing that? Well, the bishop is obviously much nicer placed on this diagonal, and black no longer has the option to place a pawn on e6, which will considerably reduce the strength of that bishop on the diagonal. So after bishop e7 we get a relatively calm opening. Center is closed, both sides are developing their pieces, and definitely it's still something Magnus had been preparing, because last year MVL had this exact position against Levon Aronian. In that game MVL played the move bishop e6, but for this occasion he decides to play the move knight d7. So he says, okay, I'm ready to exchange the dark squared bishops. That's a good trade for me, because in general having pawns placed on that same color, the dark squared bishop is not such a great piece. Here the knight comes into d5, hits the queen gotta go back to deal with the knight fork on c7. So queen d8, and here white has different ways of playing. A standard move, of course, is castling kingside. Another move, a typical plan for these structures, is to reroute the knight from f3 to d2 and then to f1 and e3. Also interesting. But before doing any of these moves, look at this. Magnus grabs space on the king side with the move h4. Maybe he really wants to get in knight g5, which is a nice square for the knight, getting the support from the pawn on h4, and there are indirect threats against the pawn on f7. So h6 is played. White now plays the move c3. Black goes for the move knight f6. The knight comes back, challenges the knight on d5, and very soon the bishop will likely come to e6. So the knight on f3, it's not doing that much. So as I already said, the knight often gets rerouted. Here it goes to d2, but I think objectively speaking there are no serious issues here for black at all. A typical plan would be just to swap the knights in the center, get the other knight to e7, and if you go back with the bishop, then you would like to castle, move the king, and play the move f5. I've been playing these kind of positions with black myself as well, and I think black is getting quite a comfortable game when you get in this move f5. But MVL instead played the move castling kingside. Knight takes f6 is played. Queen takes f6, and now the knight comes to f1. The knight is on its way to e3. Black, probably not playing accurately here, goes for the move king h8. And the idea is that after knight e3, the queen goes to g6. So the queen looks great, and black is about to play the move f7, f5, opening up the f-file for the rook. And if you have to take back with the bishop, well, very soon the other rook will join play as well. Looks nice for black, but the next move by Magnus is very strong. He played here the move g4. He is just advancing his pawns on the king side, making it impossible for black to launch this pawn break. Knight d8 is played. The knight is on its way to e6 and then to f4 probably. Queen f3 played, and I think if you prematurely play something like knight e6, there's always the possibility to get in the knight to f5 as well. So I think the bishop would like to retain control over that square. Bishop d7 is played, and here Magnus continues with its plans. He played the move g5. He really wants to open up that h-file, and obviously black will not allow that. The question is he going to advance the pawn to h5, trying to keep the king side closed? But then, okay, the queen also doesn't look very nice on g6. Maybe there are even ideas for white to shift the attention to the other side of the board. The queen cannot really go away because the pawn on h5 got to keep protection from the queen. So instead of advancing the pawn, knight e6 played. But here white opens up the king side. G takes h6, G takes h6, and various ideas. I really would like to do something about my king and get the other rook involved. And honestly, knight e5, it's probably not the move I would have played. I would probably have gone for something like king d2 with the idea to get a rook over. But with knight e5, I guess that Magnus really wanted to prevent the knight from getting into f4. But by moving the knight away from e3, white no longer covers the f5 square. So black now hurries up here with the move f5, hoping to generate some activity against the white queen along the f-file. Castling queenside played, and this is very interesting and complicated position, but exactly the sort of game Magnus is looking for. I think if you do take the pawn, white is probably not even interested in taking back, but maybe even queen e3, so that you would like to keep queens on the board and try to take back with the pawn, get a rook over to the g-file, and it's clear that black's king is potentially much more vulnerable, much more exposed. So instead of taking on e4, MVL plays the move b5, hits the bishop, rook hg1, counter-attacking, not moving the bishop yet, just hitting the queen. Queen h7, queen got to stay close to the black king, bishop b3. And still, interesting moment, lot of different ideas. You may still take on e4, but MVL played the move c4. He really is trying to steer things up. And it's very complex position, difficult to say what exactly both players were thinking. But I assume that after taking the pawn, black's idea is to take on e4, to attack the queen. The queen on h7 defends the pawn on e4, but even here, white is clearly having the upper hand. If you continue with queen e3, very soon the bishop will come to c2, and I really like white's position here still. But Magnus didn't take on c4. He dropped back with the bishop immediately, so he's looking for potential threats against the queen on this b1 h7 diagonal. F takes e4 is played now. Queen takes e4. So now actually the queens are coming off the board. And the pawn on f2 is even hanging. But why is Magnus going for this line? Well, he really sees that the pawn on d6 is a source of problem for black. If you take on f2, probably knight e7 can be played with the idea to take on d6. Knight can come to f5 or give a check on g6. White is seizing the initiative. So before taking on f2, black first plays here the move bishop to e8. The bishop is on its way to a better square. But now, another interesting moment. I mean, there's so many different possibilities here. If you do play knight e7, which was not the choice of Magnus, I think the best response here is to go knight f4. There's no time to take on d6 because there's knight e2 as a threat, and black is hanging in there. This is not clear at all. But Magnus instead played here the move f4. Really strange looking move, but it has a clear idea. It's tactically very complicated. So the plan is that if you take with the pawn on f4, there is knight e7 with a threat to take on d6 with ideas maybe to play e5, get the bishop involved. Knight can come to f5. White is looking great here. If you do take with the knight on f4, then knights are coming off the board and the rook takes on d6. The pawn on h6 is threatened to be taken, although you can still take on h4. But let's see what happened in the game, because black didn't take the pawn on f4, but played here bishop h5 first, hitting the rook on d1. Rook d2, of course, you not want to give up the rook. And still, things are not clear. Black should just take with the knight on f4. Aim for the exchange of pieces. Now after rook takes d6, white is threatening checkmate in 1. But after king h7, things are far from clear. Black is quite active with a rook on f4. The bishop on c2 is unable to join the attack. But let's see the difference now with what happened in the game. Things are getting incredibly exciting. Pawn takes f4 was played by MVL, and probably he was getting too relaxed, believing that he just has a very nice passed pawn, everything is under control. But this is exactly what Magnus had been looking for. And I believe that the next move he played is a serious contender for the move of the year. Because I'm 100% sure that NVL had not seen coming it at all. White played here the absolute shocking move, knight to c7. What is happening here? You're placing the knight on the square where it can just be taken by the knight. But if you do so, the rook will take on d6. And as I said already, you're threatening to take on h6, which is checkmate. It's lettermate on the G and H file. The king is not able to protect the pawn on h6 because it allows the move e5, opening up the diagonal for the bishop. The bishop joins with check. It's going to be checkmate very soon. The alternative is to play rook f7, so that if you take on h6, well, there's rook h7, black consolidates. But much better is to reverse the move order by starting with this move e5, opening up the diagonal for the bishop once again, so the rook is unable to interfere on h7. Now, if you play something like rook g7, with the idea that after rook takes h6, the king can come to the g file, it's not checkmate, well, at least you can take here and then even insert a check to push the king to the edge of the board. And then after taking on h5, white is having an extra pawn with really good prospects of converting the material advantage. Absolutely fantastic idea. But what should black do then if he cannot take the knight on c7? White is threatening to take the rook or even to take himself on e6. And of course, rook takes d6 is also a threat. But here we see the skills of MVL. He's not giving up here yet and goes for this idea of rook g8. What is this? After rook takes g8, rook takes. White is capturing the piece on e6, even threatens to take the pawn on f4. White is a full piece up. But the game goes on. Rook g1 check. Here we see that the king doesn't have any good square to go to. Bishop d1 is the only move. But then your bishop is pinned. You're not threatening to take the bishop on h5. It's very unpleasant here. Rook f1 is played. Very resourceful idea. So the rook supports the pawn on f4 and black has a simple plan of mobilizing the f-pawn. Rook takes d6 and after the move f3, knight to f4, you're hitting the bishop on h5, but there is bishop to g4. And here we have the critical moment of the game. Just let's have a look. Magnus is a piece up. You would expect him to be completely winning here. But it's not so simple, in fact. Let's see. If you play a move like king d2, trying to get your king closer to the pawn, there is rook takes d1 with check. King takes d1 and f2, discover check. On the next move, black promotes and gets a new queen. That is not possible. However, what should white do? I mean, Magnus played here the move knight g6, which is apparently the move which gives away the advantage. There is one very spectacular move which would have won the game for white. You may pause the video for a second and try to find it yourself. If Magnus cannot find it, I really think it's incredibly difficult. Now you know that there is a win, you may spot it. But in a game, to find this move knight h5 is really tough. It's in fact absolutely insane. The idea is that the knight cannot really be taken. If you do that, it's rook takes h6 with check. The king goes away, you pick up the bishop. And there's no really a possibility of queening your f-pawn. You're threatening rook takes d1 and move the pawn. But there's rook f5. The rook is ideally placed behind the passed pawn. The king will come over and soon the pawn on f2 will be taken. White's completely winning. But instead of taking the knight on h5, how about f2? When there are all sorts of threats, including just to take on d1 and then promote the f-pawn. But here the key idea is to give a check on the d-file. This is so important. You could have taken on h6, but here we will get to see why the rook should give a check here and keep the bishop defended. After king h7, only move, you have knight f6, check. King goes away, here you take on g4, and you can just take the pawn on f2 next. You will still be a piece up, or you can even play rook f8. And of course, big point is rook takes d1, with the idea of clearing the promotion square. There is rook takes d1 and white is just back in time consolidating its position. Well, incredibly difficult. Magnus didn't spot it and played here the move knight g6. Very logical move in a way. But after king g7, all of a sudden things are not so simple. Because in some lines, if you ever move the rook, the knight can also be hanging. if you do play knight e5 to attack the bishop and the pawn, bishop goes to h5. If the rook goes away, you can play something like f2. And there are all these threats again. It's very difficult to prevent the pawn from promoting. If you take on f2, just rook takes d1, and the endgame is not better for white. Black has won its piece back. So king c2 is the move played instead by Magnus. Black is not in a rush, played here the move h5, so that if you ever advance the pawn on h5 defends the bishop. Very important. Knight e5 played. And now f2, it's on the board. So here again, we have all these sorts of threats to take on d1 once again. And if you take on g4, h takes g4, well, there's another problem. The g-pawn can come. So this doesn't solve anything. You can give a check on g6, which was played in the game, but then it's king h7, and d1 is still hanging. Rook f6 played. You get behind that f-pawn. That's the main priority here. Bishop takes d1 with check. Black has won its piece back. King d2. And the bishop goes now to g4, threatening this check on d1, followed by promoting the pawn. But after king e3, okay, white is given back the piece, but the king is now in charge of the f-pawn. Rook e1 check. King takes f2, rook takes e4, knight takes g4, rook takes g4. We have a rook endgame with only 4 pawns each, and well, a lot of people would expect here just to see a very boring draw. People could agree here to a draw already, in fact, but the game goes on for another 30 moves or so. Rook f5, check. Not check, but double attack. I mean, threatening to capture the pawn on h5, of course. King g6. Rook takes b5. Magnus grabbing the pawn. Rook takes h4. Now, both sides have the chance to create passed pawns on each wing. King g3, rook g4. King h3, rook e4. Moving the rook away to be able to give a number of checks. a4 played. a6. It looks like a good move. If you do give a check here, king g5, and if you take on a6, then it's rook e3. King goes back, rook e2, and you pick up the pawn on b2. Unproblematic for black at all. So rook a5 played. So keeping the king cut off the 5th rank. Rook e6, defending the pawn. King h4, attacking the pawn on h5. Rook e4, king g3, rook e6 back. Could be a repetition. Magnus continues his trademark style. He is not accepting a draw here yet. Rook b6, aiming for simplifications. Going after the pawn on b2. Okay, white captures first on c4. Rook takes b2, rook c6, king f7. Rook takes a6. And here, MVL knows very well that the king should just come over to the queen side. And with rooks and the bishop pawn, even without the pawn on h5, it should be an easy draw. Let's see how it works. First of all, white would have to get rid of that pawn on h5, but black is just advancing the pawn. White is activating the king. White is not afraid of that h-pawn at all. First pushes the king back to the back rank. King d8, rook h7. Hitting the pawn h2 played, and here it's the move c4. And now a very nice technical move. Before anything else, you cut off the king, not enabling white to bring the king closer to its own pawns. c5, king c8, a5. Looks as if white is making progress, but as I said, the king cannot do anything. And here, nice technical move. Rook d1, threatening to promote the h-pawn. So rook takes h2, and now king b7. The king is getting in charge now. Again, you're about to wrap up the c-pawn first, and then the pawn on the a-file as well. Rook h6, and now you can just give a check. There's no good place to hide for the king. King d6, rook d1, king e7, king c7. Excellent move. These pawns are, once again, not dangerous. a6 played, rook a1. Here you see the king is nicely shouldered by the king on c7. White absolutely unable to make progress. And after rook f6, rook a5, good move. Attacking the pawn, c6 played, rook takes a6. And the players are continuing till there are only 2 kings left at the board. And only here, a draw is simply inevitable. Very exciting game. We have seen what in my opinion is at least the move of the year so far. This incredible shot of knight c7. Definitely it was overlooked by a world-class player like MVL. Let me know what you think. Is this really the game or the move of the year? Did Magnus deserve to win this game? Or also credits should be given to MVL finding such incredible resource despite being a piece down to still save the game. Do you like this video? Just don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I will cover many more exciting games from the Grenke Chess Classic. See you soon again. Bye bye.